So, we're done. We're through the Olivet discourse, and we're also through the parables that Jesus tells afterwards to help people understand what he was talking about. And that brings us to this place in the narrative where a few different people are going to be asking this question, why this waste? And there are actually three parallel accounts of this particular story, and we're going to end up looking at all three because that way we can pick up the details that, maybe one guy included and another guy didn't. And so if you're flipping back and forth in your Bible, then you're going to wish that we were one of those churches that did a handout so that you could use it as a bookmark. But it seems like most of you just kind of pay attention to the screen, so I think everybody will be fine. The passages are John 12, 3 through 8, and Mark 14, 3 through 9. And then there's the passage that we are supposed to be in Matthew, and that's chapter 26, verses 6 through 13. And so we're going to look at all of those. And we start this morning reading in the passage in Mark. So this is chapter 14, I said, verse 3. And it says, while he was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper and reclining at the table, there came a woman with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume of pure nard. And she broke the vial and poured it over his head. And we're going to see later that she also poured it on his feet. But some were indignantly remarking to one another, why has this perfume been wasted? For this perfume might have been sold for over 300 denarii, the money given to the poor, and they were scolding her. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you bother her? She's done a good deed to me. For the poor you always have with you, and whenever you wish, you can do them good, but you do not always have me. She's done what she could. She's anointed my body beforehand for the burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, that also which this woman has done shall be spoken of in memory of her. So that's the entirety of the story right there. And so if we go back to the beginning and we look at it a little bit more closely, so Jesus is in Bethany, which is kind of like within sight of Jerusalem. And it turns out that this lady that shows up is Mary, the sister of Martha. And she has this vial made of alabaster that's like a semi-precious stone. And these types of vials that they had were sealed, and they had kind of a really thin neck on them. And the way you open it is you break it open at the neck. And once you break it open, it's used. All right. There's not really a good way to seal it back up. And the perfume inside is really, really expensive. They had no mechanism at all for mass production of that kind of thing. It's like a small batch specialist type deal. And so this single woman, Mary and Martha lived together, if you are familiar with the story, with their brother Lazarus, and they did their own cooking and serving. So they're not from the wealthy strata of society. They're probably of the merchant class. I don't really know what they did, but they were likely relatively poor. Those are not wealthy people at all. She's doing her own cooking and cleaning and serving. So they don't even have one person to help them, or a slave or a servant or anything like that. So she shows up here with this treasure. All right. And this is not unusual to the point of being unheard of. So back in this day, there was no way to put money into a CD or some kind of investment account or anything like that. There's no, social security of any kind. And there's no retirement benefits for anybody. So what happens when you get old? And especially if you're a woman that's not married and you don't have any kids that are going to help take care of you. Okay, so These are somewhat perilous times for, especially for women. You could easily wind up elderly and destitute if you didn't have any kind of safety mechanism. And so families would often have these kinds of treasures that they would just pass on to daughters. And the treasure could be her dowry if she needed it to be, and there was nothing else. And it would also be what would keep her safe if her husband died or if some other thing went wrong. And so this vial of perfume may have been in her family for a really long time. And they would just keep passing it down until one of the daughters needed it for something. And so she walks in and she doesn't ask anybody if it's okay. Nothing like that at all happens. She breaks open the vial and she pours it on Jesus. And everybody reacts like, whoa, like what just happened? All right. I can't believe she just did that. Thing's worth 300 denarii. So there's this like outcry that paints this act as completely foolish and wasteful. And as if it's some kind of a useless act. And so Mary's like standing there and everyone's on her case. And you got to wonder if maybe she's starting to second guess, right? Like whether or not this was such a good idea. Maybe she did make a mistake. And if they're asking, why has this been wasted this way? What exactly does waste mean? What are they saying when they ask that? And I would suggest that they are talking about, waste being when you give too much to get, a little bit in return. And so if you pay $1 for a 50-cent candy bar, you wasted 50 cents. And if it, takes you 2 hours to do a 1 hour job, then you wasted an hour. And so if you're putting in more than you're getting out, then that is, kind of how they're using this word waste, can be considered waste. And so these people are watching this lady pour perfume on Jesus. And we know what the value of the stuff is. It says that it's over 300 denarii. And so one denarius is 1 day's wage for a grown working man. And so this is very nearly 1 year's full wages for an adult man. So in today's terms, the median income for an adult man in this country is, around the neighborhood of 50 grand. And so this is like a $40,000 or $50,000 bottle of perfume. And, at least that's what it would look like to the people who were watching this happen. And so that's kind of why they're reacting this way, is it's a pretty costly little thing that she's got in her hand. And so that's sort of the basic setup for what we're talking about. And I think that's valuable to ask the question of who these people are that are actually asking why this waste, and giving this lady kind of a hard time. And so in order to answer that question, we're going to go to the version of events that's in John. So if you are in your Bible, then time to flip pages. So we're going to look at his version of events. This is starting in verse 3 of, I think I said John 12. It says, Mary therefore took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples who was intending to betray him, said, why has this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people? So it's Judas, right, that says this. And, that kind of makes some sense. It's exactly like something Judas would say. And I mean, we know some stuff about Judas, and Judas is looking at 300 denarii on one side and Jesus on the other side, and there's just no comparison. This is a total waste. If it was water, it might still be a waste for Judas. So, Judas did not have a super high value for Christ. He's not a believer. Okay. He doesn't believe that this is God sitting in front of him. This is the disciple that never once refers to Jesus as Lord, not one time. And he must have been pretty good as like someone who could pretend to be something that he wasn't. So we don't have any indication that he was ever a believer in the stories that we have about it. The text here says that he was intending to betray him. And if you knew who Jesus was, like as the Son of God or the incarnate God or whatever, and you really believed that, then betrayal is not something that you could even consider. And this guy's been following Jesus around for like 3.5 years at this point. And even very early in the ministry of Jesus, Jesus knew that this was going to happen. And so in John 6, Jesus says that he chose all 12 of these guys, and yet one of you is a devil. And so Jesus knew that Judas was not with him all the way from the beginning. And so Jesus was never confused at all about this point. And so why would Judas follow Jesus around for all this time if he didn't really believe in who he was? And so in all likelihood, it's just that Judas was the same as all the other people around there. They believed that if Jesus was the Messiah, then he was there to start a kingdom and he was going to take over the world. He's going to crush their enemies. And they had seen Jesus perform these miracles. So he'd raised a guy from the dead like a week before this. And so, he had exactly the kind of power to kind of lead the revolution that these people wanted to see. And, the problem, though, is that as time goes on, it becomes increasingly clear that Jesus had no intention at all of doing anything like that. And that was especially true in the week that they had just lived through at the time that this story is told. So Jesus had just like completely alienated the Jewish religious leadership of the entire country in the confrontations that we talked about in chapters 22 through 24. And it really was becoming crystal clear that the whole idea of a political takeover just wasn't on Jesus's radar. It's not going to happen. And some, if not every single one of these guys, had been thinking that if Jesus took power, then they would sort of be on the inside track to power with him. And they would have this position of privilege and, power over the people around them. And they would be in the new leaders like cabinet of advisors or something like that. But Judas has at this point come to the realization that Jesus is not going to do this. And that makes Jesus just some weirdo. All right. He's a freak. And Judas is some kind of chump that has let himself be taken in by this whole like little magic trick show. And so he decides to get out of this deal, whatever he can get out of it. And what he could get was 30 pieces of silver. All right. That's like a few $1,000s for us. And that was, the token that he had to take home with him for all of his wasted time. And so shortly after this event at the Last Supper, Jesus says that one of the 12 is going to betray him. And I would think, from what we have of the story, that when Jesus says that, 11 guys would turn and look at Judas. Okay. But that's not what happened. Not even one person guessed that it might be Judas. They sat there and wondered if maybe it was them. That's how good Judas is at pretending to be something that he isn't. Not one single person suspected that he wasn't a true believer, even while he was as false as he could possibly be the entire time that he was with them. And that makes this kind of similar to the idea that we studied last week about the nominal believers. all right, that hang around and they kind of look like true believers. In fact, some of them look more like true believers than true believers. So Judas was just like that. Judas is the character here that stands for the world. All right, this is the world that doesn't know God, doesn't believe in God. And the world will look on and think that, if you want to have a little bit of Jesus or a little bit of religion, then, that could be cool. Might be a place in life for a little bit of religion or a little morality or something like that, as long as you don't go too far. All right. You can't get carried away with that kind of thing. You got to keep things in their proper perspective, balance, and it's cool if the whole God thing makes you feel better somehow. But if somebody ever gets to the point where they're ready to live sort of all in for God, then the world reacts like you are wasting something precious as you spend your life on God. You're a fanatic, all right? Or you're sucked in by a cult. There's something wrong with you somehow. You're not thinking clearly. And if you actually grow in your excitement for following Christ, you're going to get pushback, all right, from your family, from your friends, as they try and steer you back towards the things that really matter, all right, like your career or your 401k or keeping your lawn free of crabgrass or whatever. Okay. And so this idea of what it is that is wasteful comes from the value system that you have. And although we don't really like to say it this way, the true agenda of the people of the world is centered around the self. Okay. We're primarily concerned with what is good for me. And this was certainly the case for Judas, as we can see in verse 6. John says, "Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it." So that's kind of funny. Obviously, John didn't know this when this happened. Maybe Jesus told John later. I don't know. They certainly had no idea this was going on at the time. And so Judas is actually not concerned with the poor. His real agenda was that money might be put into the box where he would have access to it. So this was all about what he could have gained from this. And so that's exactly the perspective of the world. And I think that it's a little bit interesting here, the place where you're starting from has a tendency to determine where it is that you land. And so Jesus tells a story in Luke 12:16-21 that relates a little bit to this. It says he told them a parable saying the land of a certain rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, "What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?" So this guy's a landowner, right? That's the elite class of the time and the place. And he's obviously successful. He's got so much grain that he doesn't have room for all of it. And he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods." So this guy's already got multiple barns, and he's going to tear them down and build giant barns or silos, and he fills them all up with grain again. "And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." So it's a picture of a successful guy. All right. The world would look at this guy and say that this is exactly how you're supposed to do things. Exactly. Nothing wrong with this at all. Right. Here's your model of what success looks like. But do we mean that this guy is spiritually successful? No. Do we mean that he's relationally successful? Mm-mm. We mean that he's materially successful. And so our world works just exactly like theirs did then. This is the kind of success that really matters. This is what we're talking about when we talk about success. If you don't qualify it somehow, this is success. And so success is having so much grain that you have to build bigger buildings to hold it all. Grain was like gold in that day. Okay, this was cash that he's talking about. This guy has got so much that he can't even spend it. He may as well just eat, drink, and be merry. Take it easy. That's what it looks like to succeed. Built an agricultural empire, independently wealthy. And now it's time for some hedonism. All right. This is exactly the picture that we admire most today. This is the life that the Villages is selling. Okay. This is the raisins on the beach in Boca Raton. All right. This is precisely what many of us have been taught to aspire to. But this is not how God defines success. God said to him, "You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God." Just a little bit of a different perspective. Guys put years of hard work into this, and he's just completed this empire that he's got, and God's just like, that is so stupid. All right, you spent your whole life doing this thing, and in a single moment, it's all gone. Like, really gone. You have no access to it ever for the rest of eternity. It's gone for you. And so this guy's like headed out of the world the exact same way he came in. All these piles of crap that he has amassed belong to someone else now. Right? So it's this guy that's been the chump. And we should kind of see what God is saying here. You know, if God is real, if Jesus is who he says he is, then getting carried away or fanatical about something that's eternal is hardly foolish or a waste. And I think it was Mueller who said he is no fool who gives away that which he cannot keep in order to gain that which he can't lose. So that might be something that, you know, some of us should integrate into our thinking. Okay. And so I think it was Moody who said, if Jesus is not real, then we've all gone way too far. If he is real, then we haven't gone nearly far enough. All right. I think that's really true. So some people, you know, might want to give themselves to, you know, material avarice, like the guy in the parable, building up money, having a big house, nice cars, you know, financially secure future, stuff like that. Others might really be hunting the prestige of being admired. Right? You're such a great scholar, or, you know, some kind of awesome musician or a great public speaker or whatever. It's not really about the money so much as it is about the prestige that goes along with excellence. All right. And so, you know, comparing the number of silos that they have in one way or another to the people around them, it's still the same kind of motivation. It's just a different expression of it. The guy in the parable ended up in a place that was all about sensual experience. All right. So it just became about the ease and, you know, what felt good and what tasted good and stuff like that. The party, right? Raw sensory experience might be the point for some of us. And I'm not going to tell you that a life lived for these things would necessarily be awful somehow. Okay. You might not be miserable if you were rich or if everybody thought you were awesome. All right. But None of those things like that are going to be anywhere near as good as you think they're going to be. They're certainly not the answer to any of your questions. So each of these things does bring kind of a seasonal pleasure. All right. But the real problem is that they're temporary. Okay. None of them last. And you can have these things for a little while, but then they're going to be snatched away and you're going to be left with nothing. And so, like what if this smart business guy had built all these new silos on a bed of quicksand? And as soon as he got them full, they started to sink. Okay. We would be astounded at how stupid he was for not checking the soil before he started building. And yet, all of us do the exact same thing. That's exactly what he did. And so when we live our whole lives for something that is most certainly temporary, it amounts to the exact same thing. It's all going to sink out of sight. It's all going to disappear and be lost forever. And so it's just two totally different viewpoints that have no way to be reconciled, right? This is two colliding ways of looking at the world. And so now this is the version in Matthew. This is the passage we are supposed to be looking at this morning. Turns out there is actually a little bit more to learn. And it says that now when Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume, and she poured it upon his head as he reclined at the table. It sure seems like the same story, right? That's like word for word almost. But then it says, but the disciples were indignant when they saw this. And they said, why this waste? So it's not just Judas. All right. It's the other ones too. And if we're going to talk about these guys, we have to recognize that they are actual believers. Okay. They still think this is a waste. And so the perspective here is that, like, of course we're believers. God's important. It's important to be at church and stuff like that. But, it's still important not to get carried away. You have to have balance in your life. A little moderation is healthy. And if something starts to interfere with your career or something important like that, then you've gone too far. All right. You need to get a grip. And we hear stuff like this today. All right. And I don't mean not from nominal believers, but from authentic Christians. All right. They'll take this exact same position. Mary just dumped every bit of the security that she had for the future over some guy's head. And if you had yourself all set up for the future, you're secure, and you spent that entire nest egg on some kind of kingdom work, something that you thought was, kingdom work, how many of us can actually say that there wouldn't be serious backlash from our Christian family and friends? Right? And frankly, I think that this reaction of the disciples is a lot more discordant than the reaction that we get from Judas. Okay, this is a bit more difficult to understand. At least we know that Judas is actually in all this stuff just for himself. And in his mind, anything other than investing in himself is going to be a complete waste. Judas has this like internal consistency to him. There can't be all that much in the way of like cognitive dissonance that needs to be reconciled in Judas's mind. But these guys here are real believers that also feel like maybe this is getting carried away. Maybe Mary should have weighed this out a little bit more before she did it. And right, like it's a little bit pathetic. And Jesus thought so too. Okay, Jesus is the only person in the room that actually has a different point of view on this event. So this is back in Mark 14. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you bother her? She's done a good deed to me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for the burial," right? She anointed the body of Christ. This is what those women were gonna do on Easter morning. It's fairly normal ancient practice, right? So it's today when people die, they're sort of taken from our sight and to the mortuary where they're injected with polymers and stuff. And the next time that we see them, they're smiling and in a casket. Okay, so things are a little bit more earthy back in this day. Death was right in front of you. And it was a kind of a show of affection and reverence to rub the body, the dead body, down with spices and oils. And they didn't get to do this to Jesus. All right. When they got to the tomb, it was too late. He'd already risen. And so in the end, only one person ever anointed Jesus's body. Only one person ever got the honor of showing him that affection and that reverence, and it was this Mary. And that's because she didn't wait. She acted right now. And so this thing that she is doing here, it does seem somewhat impulsive and somewhat spontaneous. But she's the only one that ever got to do this. And Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, that also which this woman has done shall be spoken of in memory of her." And so according to Jesus, this incident is more, significant than we generally think it is. And true to the prediction that Jesus made, here we are this morning talking about this in 2022. Okay, he's saying that there's something in what she did that people should sit up and pay attention to. Something special here. Something awesome somehow. And it's that there's a point that is actually possible to reach where you're no longer calculating the cost of like living for God versus the consequences that will have in your material life. You can lose track of that line that says that you've gone too far. And Mary just blasted right over the line without even a recognition that there was a line. She gave herself over to all this. This really is, from almost any point of view, this is completely crazy. Okay. And it is also so totally cool. She has lost her mind for God. Jesus was into it, right? This is like the ideal response to Jesus. And she's not calculating anything. There's a real sense of trust in her as she just completely throws her future in with Jesus. So this is a woman that had seen with her own eyes just a few days before that Jesus could take her brother who'd been dead for 4 days and bring him back to life. She's not wondering if Jesus is the Messiah. This is not an educated guess. She knew for sure who Jesus was. And so there's this like wild abandonment to the person and the power of Christ that's really quite amazing. And Jesus thought it was super cool. Lots of people saw what he did with Lazarus, and she's the only one that reacted this way. So now, like, Mary was a real person, but she's dead now. Okay. And as a believer, when she died, she went to heaven. And eventually, we're all going to die. or, God will return. And we're going to be in heaven. And we're going to sit in a room with this lady. And we're going to have the opportunity to talk to this woman. Someday we're going to meet Mary, the sister of Lazarus, and we're going to have plenty of time to talk things over with her. And when you realize that this lady sitting on the couch next to you is the woman that did the thing with the alabaster vial or whatever, or nard perfume, will you ask her if it was worth it? If you do ask her if it was worth it, what do you think she would say? I think she's going to laugh at you. All right. I think you're both going to laugh as soon as you realize how ridiculous that is. If she answers your question, she'll say that she wishes she had 10 more of those vials to break that day. Right? This is a completely different value system than the one that the world gives us to live with and to make our decisions based on. All right. When your perspective is eternal, it changes everything. Chapter 12 of John, verse 3 said, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. John was there that day, and he's writing this gospel years later, and he's thinking back on that day, and he's remembering that smell, right, that filled the whole house. You know how smells can be sometimes. Watchman Nee has a bunch of cool biblical insights. It spills into allegory sometimes. And about this event, he says, if you want the odor to go out, then the vial has to be broken. So he's reading into this a little bit, okay? Pulling out a little bit of an allegorical picture. And I'm not saying that an allegorical interpretation is correct for the, every story in the Bible, or even, most of them. But the point that Nee is making is correct, even if he didn't get the point from this passage. And so from Paul's own words, the outer man, right, the vessel of clay must be broken so that we bear in the body of the dying Jesus, so that the life of Jesus can be manifest, right? That's what we're talking about. Then 2 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul talks about how God constantly manifests through us the aroma of Christ in every place. Okay, to some, the sweetest smell they've ever scented, to others, a choking gas leading from death to death, he says. But it's the same smell, right? It's the same smell, the sweetest smell they've ever scented, or the choking gas. It's not a different smell. It's a different smeller. The effect depends upon your orientation or your inclination. Are you inclined to follow God, or are you looking for excuses to keep him away from you? And the truth is that this all-in commitment, that's unreserved, all-in stuff is the main condition for doing that work of breaking the outer man and releasing the power or the aroma that has such an impact on the world. All right. So that idea is present in more than one passage, even if it's not really the intent of this passage. All right. So, Mary had recently seen her brother raised from the dead. I already commented on that, but she really knew what was going on and who Jesus was. And so we may feel like we don't have that same advantage. So it's not fair to expect the same thing from us. But just before Lazarus was raised from the dead, and they're all standing around the tomb, and they all had tears running down their faces. This beloved man has died, and Jesus could have prevented it. They knew Jesus was a healer. He could heal people before they died. But what could he do now, right? Once it's too late. He didn't get there in time to save this guy. And it turns out he did that deliberately. So they're all standing around there, and Mary, this Mary, comes up to Jesus and she grabs his cloak. She's on her knees crying, and she says, "If only you had been here, you could have saved him." And Jesus says, "Mary, your brother will live." Jesus knew exactly what he was going to do. And she says, "I know, like we all live in the resurrection of the dead, right?" And Jesus says, "No, I am the resurrection and the life. And anyone who believes in me will never perish, even as they die." And he asks her if she really believes that. And I'm not sure if it records her answer anywhere. But then Jesus walks over to the tomb and he shouts for Lazarus to come forth. And Lazarus walks out of the grave. All right in front of all these people. They're standing there crying. And Jesus demonstrates that he really is who he says he is. He is the resurrection and the life. And if Mary didn't already believe when Jesus said it, she sure as heck believes it now. Okay, she believed all right. Like that's the moment, like Mary's faith like exponentially skyrockets at that point. And this same thing can happen to us. So the more that we begin to experience God, and the more that the goodness of God begins to sink in with us, and the more we realize just how real God is, the more sense it makes to believe in God more than you believe in anything else. And I would suggest that we may not have, Lazarus raised from the dead in front of us, but we have enough to believe more in God than we do in the world. And, none of this is going to make any sense at all until you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. This thing that we're talking about here only applies to people that have already had a personal encounter with God and started a relationship with God through Christ. And if you don't have that, then hearing stories like this one this morning, it just sounds like craziness. It's nonsense. They don't make any sense at all. But when you do come into personal knowledge of God and the living Christ indwells you through the Holy Spirit, things start to look differently. You hear a story like this and you go, you want that kind of faith. You're just not sure you want to pay the cost to have it. Right? What Mary does here makes sense to a lot of us. But can we do it without Jesus standing there? So many of you are familiar with Francis Chan. Used to be the pastor at a huge mega church in California. He was like the prototypical popular and charismatic mega church pastor and personality. All right. I used to publicly make fun of him in his church. All right. Because I too am a sinner. But like since that time, he's changed the focus and the trajectory of his life and his ministry. And he's written at least one really good book since that time. And in his explanation for how all that happened, he said, "Last summer, I came to a shocking realization that I had to share with my wife. If Jesus had a church in Simi Valley, mine would be bigger. People would leave his church to attend mine because I call for an easier commitment. I know better how to cater to people's desires so that they stick around." Jesus was never really good at that. He was the one who said, "He who loves father and mother, son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." I'm much more popular than Jesus. Turns out that like popularity is not something that Francis Chan could pursue if he was going to pursue Jesus. And, he came to realize who the real Jesus was, and he sacrificed everything he had built, walked away from it. All right. And so this guy that I used to make fun of because I'm a sinner, is now someone that is a model that looks very much like this woman that people will speak of for all time wherever the gospel is told. All right. And so Jesus really did say that if you love your family more than him, then you're not worthy of him. He also said that unless you forsake everything, then you're not worthy to be called his disciple. If Jesus is not Lord of all, then he's not Lord at all. The thing that we really need is to start to experience the thrill of the committed life in Christ. It's that's going to dwarf the misery and the drudgery or the mediocrity of a half-baked walk with God. All right. Few things are quite as pitiful or difficult to understand as a half-committed Christian. All right. You're too far down the road to be really useful to the world, but you haven't gone far enough to be of any real use to Christ either. So you live in this place of limbo where you kind of resent whatever it is that you think you've given up, and yet you don't feel any of the joy of the Lord that shows up when you completely give yourself over to him, right? Without reservation. And so, you can really just sit around and be miserable when that's your spiritual situation. And people aren't going to be attracted to your like mediocre devotion either, or your halting walk with God. If Christ isn't real enough for you to commit yourself to, then you may as well enter back into the world, right? Like eat, drink, and be merry. Okay. You may as well live in a manner that's consistent with your level of faith. But if God is real, then we may as well come to grips with it. Okay. May as well act like it. Calls for an all-in commitment. It really does. All right. It just dramatically overwhelms what most half-hearted Christianity looks like, right? This half-hearted Christianity characterizes way too many of Christian communities today. And so, like, it's my sincere prayer that God spares us from this half in faith stuff. That, like, how can it possibly have any eternal impact? I mean, God uses what he has to work with, but like, let's give him something. And so, like hesitating to break the vial is what we're talking about. And, throwing your lot in with God. We can't hesitate to break the vial. I know you already hesitated, but now, so the world is always going to view spending your life or spending your time or spending your money on eternal things as like a tragic waste of resources. You're not going to get support for this idea. But there really is more than one way to look at things, and spending your resources on eternal things may not be as wasteful as the people around you or you even think that it is. Okay, spending your life chasing financial security or prestige may be a ton more wasteful than it looks like it is.